Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, Walter turned the radio to the same old station, the one that still played Sinatra and Bennett, and set the dining table for two plates, 2 glasses, 2 neatly folded napkins, pressed and white. Then, as always, he placed a single yellow tulip in the small vase at the center, her favorite flower. The house was too quiet now. It had been that way for 10 years, ever since Margaret passed away. Yet Walter never let the silence win. He filled it with small routines, with the same motions repeated each night, as if habit could rewrite time. His daughter Emily had begged him to stop. "Dad, you don't have to keep setting a place for Mom. It's not healthy," she'd said last Christmas, her voice soft but firm. Walter just smiled. "It's not for her, darling," he answered. "It's for me." He wasn't delusional. He knew she wouldn't walk through the door again. But when he laid the fork beside the plate, he could almost hear her laugh, that quiet, bubbling sound that always followed his terrible jokes. When he poured her wine, he swore he could see her reflection in the glass. The neighbors thought he was eccentric. The new couple across the street whispered about the widower who dines with ghosts. Walter didn't mind. Ghosts were better company than pity. At 6:15 he always began his meal. Halfway through, he would raise his glass toward the empty chair and say softly, "To us." Then he'd take a slow sip, as if sealing a promise. But on this particular Thursday evening, something felt different. He couldn't tell why. Maybe it was the wind that rattled the kitchen window, or the faint hum of a car that stopped too long outside. Maybe it was nothing at all, or maybe it was everything. As he sat down, he noticed something unusual. The tulip in the vase was not yellow but white. He frowned. He was sure he'd bought yellow ones that morning. He never forgot. Then, faintly, the radio crackled. Sinatra's voice faded, replaced by static, and then, for just a moment, a woman's whisper. "You kept your promise, Walt." He froze. The fork slipped from his hand. The sound vanished as quickly as it came. The house was silent again, but Walter's pulse was racing, not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He turned toward the empty chair. For the first time in a decade, he didn't see emptiness. He saw a shadow, faint and flickering, like the outline of someone sitting there. And in that fragile moment between disbelief and wonder, Walter whispered back, "I never stopped." The next morning, Walter woke earlier than usual. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a dream he couldn't shake. The white tulip, the voice on the radio, the feeling that she had been there, just for a moment. He told himself it was the mind playing tricks. That's what age did, turned memories into ghosts. Still, when he walked past the table, the tulip stood tall, perfect, and pure. Not wilted, not moved, but definitely white. He stared at it, lost in thought. Margaret had always said white tulips meant forgiveness. He hadn't understood why she cared so much about meanings until now. That afternoon, his daughter Emily came to visit, bringing groceries and her usual nervous smile. "Dad, you look pale. Everything okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Walter replied. "Just didn't sleep well." As she unpacked the bags, Emily's gaze fell on the table. "White tulips?" she asked, puzzled. "You always buy yellow ones." Walter paused, searching for words. "They were yellow yesterday." Emily laughed softly. "Maybe the florist mixed them up." Maybe, but Walter had the receipt and it said yellow. After she left, the silence returned, heavier this time. Walter turned on the radio again. Sinatra played smooth as ever, but halfway through "Fly Me to the Moon," the station cut out, replaced by that same faint static. Then, just beneath it, barely audible, came a whisper. "Don't be afraid." He froze. His breath caught in his throat. He turned the volume down, but the voice remained, soft and steady, woven into the static like a heartbeat greater than. "Who kept your promise?" "I never left." Walter's hand trembled as he reached for the radio dial. His mind said hallucination, but his heart whispered Margaret. He spent the evening sitting by the window, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. It was the kind of light she used to love, warm, golden, forgiving. He remembered how she'd sit beside him with a cup of tea, teasing him for oversugaring his. That night he dreamt vividly for the first time in years. He was back in their old kitchen. Margaret stood by the stove, humming softly, stirring soup. When she turned to him, her face glowed with a peace he'd never seen before, greater than. "It's almost time," she said gently. "For what?" he asked. "For you to forgive yourself." He woke up in tears. The next morning, he found something on the table that hadn't been there before, a handwritten note, yellowed at the edges, tucked beneath the vase. His handwriting, her words. It read, "If you ever doubt me, look for the white tulip." He didn't remember writing it, but his heart did. For 3 days, Walter tried to convince himself that everything was coincidence. A misprinted receipt, a trick of light, a tired old man's mind turning soft with grief. But every time he looked at that white tulip, something inside him whispered, "No, this means something." On the 4th evening, a storm rolled in, heavy rain, the kind that drowns out thought. Thunder cracked as Walter walked past the old writing desk, Margaret's desk. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. It still smelled faintly of her lavender hand cream. He stood there for a long moment, then pulled open the top drawer. Stacks of letters, recipe cards, old birthday notes, the small paper history of a shared life. And at the bottom, folded and sealed, was an envelope addressed in her handwriting. The ink had faded, but the words were unmistakable. Greater than. For Walter. To be opened when the tulips bloom again. His breath caught. He sat down, hands trembling as he tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet written in that looping, careful style he'd watched her perfect over decades. Greater than. "My love, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Please don't cry too much. You always hated how puffy your eyes got. I know you'll want to be angry at the world, maybe even at me. But don't be. We had our time, and what a time it was. Promise me one thing. When spring returns, and you see tulips again, don't buy yellow. Buy white. White for forgiveness. White for letting go. White for remembering love, not loss." Walter stared at the words until the ink blurred through his tears. He could almost hear her voice, teasing, warm, alive. Then, at the bottom of the letter, a postscript. "Puss, you always said music keeps people alive. So play our song, even when you're alone. Especially then." He folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. For the first time in months, the silence didn't hurt. He walked to the living room and turned on the old record player. Sinatra's voice filled the room again, steady, gentle, eternal, greater than. "Fly me to the moon." Walter sat back, eyes closed, and swore he felt a hand brush against his cheek. That night he dreamed of their garden, the tulips, hundreds of them, swaying in the wind. Margaret stood among them, waving, and this time she wasn't walking away. When he woke, dawn was breaking, soft gold pouring through the curtains. On the table, beside the vase of white tulips, lay a single petal. It hadn't fallen from any flower he could see. It glowed faintly in the morning light, as if touched by something, not quite of this world. The next morning, Walter stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. The garden lay before him, wilted, unkempt, a shadow of the place Margaret had loved so dearly. He walked slowly down the narrow stone path, his cane tapping rhythmically. Everywhere he looked, he saw pieces of her. The old watering can she refused to throw away. The broken bird bath she'd said she'd fix one day, and the faded wind chime that no longer sang. He knelt by the flower bed where she used to plant her tulips. His knees cracked, and the soil felt cold beneath his fingers. For a long while, he just stayed there, silent, breathing, listening to the distant hum of the world. Then, with a sudden, steady resolve, he began to dig. The earth was heavy and wet, clinging to his hands. But he didn't care. Hour after hour he planted bulb after bulb, all white tulips. Exactly as she'd written in her letter. Neighbors passed by, watching the old man covered in mud, working like someone with purpose again. Mrs. Devereux from across the street brought him lemonade. The mailman stopped and helped carry a few pots. Even the children who usually played soccer nearby stopped to ask, "What are you planting, Mr. Walter?" He smiled faintly. "Memories," he said. When the sun set, he stood back, gazing at the patch of earth he had transformed. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a widower tending ghosts. He felt like a husband finishing something beautiful they had started together. That night, as he washed the dirt from his hands, he noticed a smudge of soil on the letter. It almost looked like a fingerprint, not his own. He didn't dwell on it. Instead, he placed the letter inside a new frame and set it beside the vase of tulips. The next morning, he woke early to the sound of laughter outside. When he looked out the window, he saw a group of small children pointing excitedly at the garden. The tulips, the ones he had just planted, had already begun to sprout. It made no sense. Bulbs didn't bloom overnight, but there they were, small white buds pushing through the soil. Trembling in the light breeze, Walter felt his breath catch. He opened the window, and for a fleeting second, the air smelled exactly like her perfume, lavender, and rain. He didn't question it. He just whispered, "Thank you." As days passed, more people came to see the miracle garden. Someone left a note, "For my mother, who loved tulips too." Others left candles, photos, even music boxes. Soon the entire block was filled with quiet offerings, tokens of love and memory. What began as Walter's private grief had become a living monument to everyone who had ever loved and lost. One evening, sitting by the blooming flowers, Walter said softly into the wind, "You were right, Margaret. Love doesn't end. It changes form." And for the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't sadness. It was peace. A few weeks later, Walter's garden had become a local landmark. People stopped daily, not out of curiosity, but reverence. The tulips stood in perfect rows, pure white against the green, as if the earth itself had chosen to heal along with him. Walter often sat by the garden gate, greeting strangers who came to leave flowers or letters. He listened to their stories, a widower who missed his wife's laughter, a daughter mourning her father, a young man saying goodbye to his childhood dog. Each story he thought was a thread, and his garden had somehow woven them together. One rainy afternoon, the postman arrived with a small, weathered envelope. No return address, just his name, Mr. Walter Lane. He frowned, hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. At first glance, he thought it was another condolence letter, but when he unfolded it, his heart skipped a beat. It was Margaret's handwriting, greater than, "If this ever reaches you, Walter, it means I didn't make it home that night. But please, my love, don't spend your days in the shadows of our house. Promise me you'll build something living, something that keeps growing, even when I can't. Maybe it's a garden, or maybe it's you. But whatever it is, let it bloom." He read the letter twice, then again, not believing what he was seeing. This wasn't the same note she'd left in her will. This one was older, written years before her passing. The ink had faded in places, the words shaky but full of love. At the bottom, she had added a line he had never seen before. "And when you see the tulips bloom faster than they should, you'll know I found a way back." Walter pressed the paper to his chest. His heart pounded, not from shock, but from an overwhelming wave of recognition. The next morning, he walked into the garden barefoot, feeling the dew between his toes. The tulips were taller now, their petals bright and open, swaying as if in greeting. He whispered softly, "You kept your promise, Maggie." A small girl, one of the neighborhood children, ran up holding a drawing, a picture of Walter and the tulips under a shining sun. She smiled shyly and said, "My grandma said flowers can talk. Do yours talk to you, Mr. Walter?" He smiled, eyes glistening. "They do," he said. "They just speak a language most people forget to listen to." That evening, Walter sat on his porch, watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the petals. He no longer felt alone. Every voice, every story, every heartbeat that passed through his garden carried a piece of the love he and Margaret had shared. As he closed his eyes, the wind rose softly, brushing through the tulips like a whisper. He heard it, faint, tender, unmistakable. Greater than, I told you, my love. Love never dies. By the following spring, the Lane garden had become more than a patch of tulips. It had become a sanctuary. People from neighboring towns came to see it, to leave letters, to breathe in its silence. Walter, now in his late 70s, had begun keeping a small notebook. He called it the garden that listens. Every day he wrote something inside, a sentence from a visitor, a quote from Margaret's old diary, or sometimes just a memory, a moment he didn't want to lose. He believed that memories, like seeds, needed tending too. One morning, a young reporter named Emily came by. She had heard stories about the man who spoke to flowers and wanted to write about him for the local newspaper. Walter agreed on one condition. You tell the truth, he said. Not about me, but about what this place really is. They sat on the porch as the sun climbed over the tulips. Walter spoke softly, his voice like an old record, worn but steady. I thought I was building a garden to remember my wife, he said. But somewhere along the way I realized I was building it to remember myself. Emily listened, pen hovering over her notepad. But for a moment she forgot to write. There was something in his tone, not sadness, but peace. She asked, Do you ever wish you could see her again? Walter smiled faintly. I see her every morning, he said, pointing to the rows of tulips. When they bloom, I see her laugh. When they bend, I see her dance. And when the wind moves through them. He paused, looking out at the field as it rippled like a wave. I swear I can hear her breathing. When Emily's article was published, it went far beyond their small town. Readers from across the country wrote letters, some about love, others about loss, all about the strange, quiet beauty of remembering. Donations started arriving to preserve the garden, and Walter used every penny to buy more seeds. That summer he planted new colors, deep red, soft yellow, sky blue. Each hue carried a story. The red was for passion, the yellow for forgiveness, the blue for the kind of love that never fades. And in the middle of the garden, he built a small wooden sign that read, Planted with love by Walter and Margaret Lane, 1962, forever. Years passed. Walter grew frail, but his garden only grew stronger. On his last day, he sat by the porch, notebook on his lap, pen still in hand. The final entry he wrote was simple. Love outlives the hands that plant it. When neighbors found him, he was smiling, facing the tulips, as if mid-conversation. Today, visitors still come to the Lane garden. They say if you stand there long enough, when the wind moves just right, you can hear a whisper weaving through the petals. Not a ghost, not grief, but the living voice of devotion. Greater than. Love never dies. It just changes form. It was early morning when the townspeople gathered at the Lane garden for the first spring without Walter. The sun hung low, painting the tulips in soft gold, and a gentle mist curled between the rows. Someone had left a small wooden box on the bench beside the porch. It was labeled simply, For Margaret. Inside were old letters, their edges curled with age, and Walter's final notebook. On the first page, written in his familiar hand, were the words, If love is planted deeply enough, even death cannot dig it up. Emily, the young reporter who had once interviewed him, stood quietly with a camera in her hand. She had become the unofficial keeper of the Lane story. After Walter's passing, she'd promised to visit every year and share his words with the world. Not for fame, but because his story reminded people that love could endure beyond time. As she walked through the tulips, she felt a strange stillness. The air seemed to hold its breath, and then like a memory taking form, a breeze rolled through the field, soft and warm. The tulips swayed, not chaotically, but together, as if moved by invisible hands. It felt like a conversation between two souls, continuing long after the world had stopped listening. Emily knelt and opened the notebook. The last entry read, The garden doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to anyone who still believes in love that doesn't ask for anything in return. She smiled through tears, whispering, Thank you, Walter, for proving it's real. Later that day, children from the town came to plant new bulbs, red, yellow, and blue, like Walter had done. Each child was told to name their flower after someone they loved. It became a yearly ritual, the Day of Tulips. Over time, the garden grew vast and colorful, spilling into the horizon like a painting. Couples renewed vows there. Families scattered ashes. Strangers came to sit in silence, and every spring the tulips bloomed a little brighter, as if remembering every story ever told beneath their petals. Years later, when Emily grew old herself, she returned one last time. She walked slowly, leaning on her cane, stopping by the wooden sign that had weathered countless winters. Planted with love by Walter and Margaret Lane, 1962, forever. She touched the engraved letters and whispered, "I told your story, Walter." The world listened. As the wind rose again, the tulips swayed, golden, gentle, alive. And in that shimmering field, Emily thought she saw two figures walking hand in hand. One tall, one small, both bathed in light, disappearing into the morning sun. Spring had arrived once more at the Lane garden. The tulips swayed in gentle unison, each bloom a silent testament to years of devotion, grief, and hope. Visitors walked quietly among the rows, their footsteps soft, as if not to disturb the whispers of the past. Emily, now older, stood at the garden's edge, notebook in hand. She had chronicled decades of stories, the lives touched by Walter's love and by Margaret's memory. Each letter, each flower, each visit had been recorded, carefully preserved, forming a living archive of emotion and remembrance. A group of children ran through the tulips, laughing and chasing each other. One of them stopped to kneel, planting a small red bulb in a carefully chosen spot. "This one is for my grandma," the child said, "so she can bloom here too." Emily smiled, watching the cycle continue. The garden was no longer just Walter's legacy. It was a place where anyone who had loved or lost could feel a connection, however fleeting, to someone they cherished. She walked to the wooden bench beside the porch, touching the worn engraving, "Planted with love by Walter and Margaret Lane, 1962, forever." A soft breeze stirred the tulips. Emily closed her eyes. She imagined Walter's voice, warm and gentle, and Margaret's laughter floating on the wind. It was as though they were still walking hand in hand, invisible but present. Above, the sky turned pink and gold. The tulips reflected the light, petals gleaming like tiny flames of memory. It was a reminder that love, patient, quiet, enduring, could transcend time and even mortality. Emily whispered softly, "Your love lives here, and now, so does mine." She left a small note in the wooden box. For anyone who needs to remember, love never truly leaves. As she walked away, the garden remained, alive in every breeze, every petal, every memory, and somewhere deep within the rows of white tulips, one could almost hear a soft, familiar voice. Love never dies, it just changes form. The Lane garden would continue to bloom forever, faithfully, beautifully, a sanctuary for all hearts willing to remember.